Hooray. All right. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. I am Mandi White-Ajmani. I am the owner of Small Brooklyn Psychology. We are a group psychology practice in Brooklyn, New York at Industry City, where we offer therapy and neuropsychological assessment to people of all ages, all backgrounds, and all psychological concerns. Um, if you, when Amira starts showing her screen, which we will do in a few minutes, actually, why don't you go ahead and do that now, Amira? I'm just gonna show off our lovely team here. Our team really makes us everything that we are. So I just want to introduce, there's myself in the bottom left, then Natasha Brown, Rebecca Abbott Sinclair, Sam Janit, Maddie Lawler, Nav Gill, Cecilia Barbosa, Megan Moxie, Ben Janitis, Olga Fuller, Amira Hanna, who's here with us today, and Danielle DeFilippo. We all have experience working with people across the lifespan, but we also have special training and experience to work with children and parents using evidence-based assessment and treatment. Now, one of my goals at Small Brooklyn has always been to be a resource to the community. So whether or not you work with us directly, we do what we can to share our mental health knowledge, our suggestions, our connections to providers. So I really always want to be available in that way. And one of the ways that we do this is through webinars with our long-term partner, Park Slope Parents, who are the originals in helping to get good and supportive information out to Brooklyn families. So if you have not if you are not a member of Park Slope Parents, even if you live somewhere else in the world, I actually think that the advice and the resources that you get in Park Slope Parents are highly worth the fairly small membership fee. It's been really instrumental to me personally, but also professionally, as I get a lot of experience and tips in career networking and all kinds of great stuff. So thank you very much to the Park Slope Parents team. So for us at Small Brooklyn, we've developed a lot of webinars like these across a whole lot of areas of psychology, from tips on managing behavior in the home and in the classroom, to what a neuropsychological evaluation is and what it does, how it helps, how to understand mental health issues in children and adults, how to take care of yourselves as parents. It's not something we do very well. But most of these talks are available for free on our website at smallbrooklyn.com/services/talks. So feel free to check those out. And so now we're going to turn to what it means to be twice exceptional, or 2E, especially for our kids. And so I'm joined today by Dr. Amira Hanna, who's going to lead this webinar. She's worked with a lot of 2E kids and families over the years and likes helping them to uncover all their nuances in her neuropsychological evaluations. When we do evaluations, it's really important to us to understand all the contributions that make up a particular kid or a person, kid or adult. And twice exceptional kids need this in particular. There are a lot of overlapping pieces in this population. So to introduce Amira Hanna, PhD, is a clinical neuropsychologist who does evaluations with children, adolescents, and young adults. She specializes in neurodevelopmental evaluations to identify challenges that impact academic functioning, such as learning disorders, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and mood and anxiety disorders. She also has experience in conducting bilingual evaluations with Arabic-speaking families, so she's a really good resource there and one of the few in the Northeast. Amira works hard to understand the child as a whole and considering sociocultural factors that impact cognitive and emotional functioning. In addition to her work with families at Small Brooklyn, Amira is also an adjunct faculty member at the NYU Child Study Center, where she continues to work on advancing research in the field of pediatric neuropsychology. Prior to joining Small Brooklyn, Amira worked at the Child Study Center with a focus on pediatric neurodevelopmental evaluations. She's also trained and supervised, she has also trained and supervised neuropsychology externs and has conducted research in pediatric neuropsychology. She completed a year-long rotation at NYU's Fink Children's Ambulatory Care Center, where she did evaluations and consulted with providers and families of children with type 1 diabetes. I'm so sorry, I'm stumbling over my words right now. Amira also worked at the Child Mind Institute for several years, doing evaluations, but also providing executive function coaching to children and adolescents. And in her free time, if there's any of that left over, Amira enjoys going on picnics, playing board games, and exploring New York City's food scene, as well as traveling the world. So please, Amira, take it over from me while I try and regain some of my verbal ability.
Thank you for the intro, Mandi. I appreciate it.
I'll rejoin you at the end. Thanks.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks for the intro, and I'm really excited to be here. Like Mandy said, I worked a lot with kids who are twice exceptional. They're really fun kiddos to work with, so I'm really excited about today's talk. All right, so we'll start with the agenda. I'm gonna start simple. So first, what does it mean to be twice exceptional? I'm assuming a lot of you know this because you chose to be here today, but we'll briefly talk about what it means. I'll also talk about some of the characteristics, so things to look for, things that are common in kids who are twice exceptional. And then we'll spend a good amount of time talking about challenges. And there are different types of challenges. There's the like identifying the kids who are twice exceptional, as well as the challenges of being twice exceptional. I'll briefly talk about some of the most common profiles of kids who are twice exceptional, and then we'll spend some time also talking about social, emotional, behavioral considerations. And then we'll end with how do we help? So support, advocacy, and then definitely have time for questions and questions later. So let's hold the questions because I am not so good at multitasking. All right. So what is twice exceptional? So the term 2E refers to students who are identified as gifted and talented and are also diagnosed with one or more of the special education categories under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. These children have extraordinary abilities and talents, as well as educational, behavioral, or emotional challenges. So just to be super clear, 2E is not a diagnosis, it's a cognitive profile. So you don't go, to the doctor and end up being diagnosed with twice exceptional. It's not like a DSM diagnosis. It's rather just a way to communicate to all the people who work with your kids that they have exceptional abilities, and they also have some challenges and deficits and things that can get in their way. So it's a profile. Um, so some common characteristics, and it's important to know every profile, every kid who's twice exceptional is super unique. So this is not like you have to have these things to be considered twice exceptional. It's just some common things we might see. So like kids who are gifted, kids who are twice exceptional might have really strong, there might be really strong conceptual thinkers. They enjoy problem solving. They like complex things. They don't want boring and easy things. They some have really strong verbal abilities, wide range of interests, intense curiosities. Uh, some are super emotionally intuitive and really have emotional depth, intense feelings, probably also intense reactions. Talents in certain domains like maybe art, technology, writing, math, reading, super keen sense of humor for some. And then they also have the challenges that uh, children with disabilities have, like disruptive, they might be disruptive, impulsive, easily bored. Uh, this is a big one, like a discrepancy between their verbal skills and their written skills. So some of you might be kind of familiar with this, like they can give you all these beautiful ideas, right? And they have like all of these great ideas, but then when you tell them to put it on paper, it looks nothing like what they said. So some of these kind of challenges, they might have like amazing talents outside of class, but they have a really hard time in school. Academic challenges, of course, rigidity, anxiety, depression. So again, there is no one profile of a 2E kid. There are all of these possible strengths as well as possible challenges. Having said that, well, I'd like you to just kind of guess the percentage. I don't even know if the chat is open, but Mandy, let me know if it's not. But if you could guess the percentage of gifted and talented students who are also identified as 2E.
If anyone has any guesses, they can feel free to put it in the chat, or you can just maybe think about them and Mira will
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
answer your unspoken thoughts.
Sounds good. We can do that. So, whatever your thoughts were, you probably are right because it's such a big range. So it's uh studies are kind of all over the place. Some it's anywhere between 2.5% to 36%. The most commonly cited percentage is about 17%. But as you can see, it's a really, really large range. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. One obvious one is just kind of inequity in gifted assessment. So not every family is able to get their child assessed to really find out if what their cognitive profile looks like, and if they really have these strengths and challenges, and if they fit that 2E profile. Um, so that's one obvious one, but there are a lot of other challenges, and that's what we'll focus on today. Unfortunately, can't easily fix the inequity piece, but we can think about other challenges that might get in the way of identifying the kids who are twice exceptional. So the disabilities and high abilities of 2E students can really produce a unique population who may fail to show high academic performance or specific disabilities. So we might find that they're not showing either really, and so they really fly under the radar for a while. So this is one challenge. There's also, not a whole lot of psychoeducation. There's not a lot of people are familiar with what is 2E, and so some of the educators, some of the tutors, some of the people who are working with the kids sort of have this, they consider the terms deficits and giftedness to be incompatible. They can't imagine that a child can have an IQ of 130 and still have a reading disorder, for example. So they're not everybody's sort of aware and familiar with this profile. And also educators may be hesitant to offer accommodations to students who are gifted despite their disability. They have a hard time seeing again that a kid can be so talented and able in some ways, but also require accommodations. This like dually diagnosed children or kids who are 2E have unique needs that really differ from just their gifted peers alone, that don't have disabilities, or their learning disabled peers who also who have average cognitive abilities, and it makes them really misunderstood. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that now. And we call them categories, but there are three kind of most common um, categories that these kids might fall into, and that's why it might be hard to identify it. First, there are the kids who are identified as gifted, but whose learning disability is not diagnosed. So here we're talking about students who pretty early on, it was pretty clear that they're gifted. They were, preschool, kindergarten, right away put in a gifted program, and did pretty well. And, there are not a ton of demands of kids in kindergarten, first grade, even second grade. And so these kids did okay, and there was really no reason to suspect a disability early on. But then once things become challenging, end of elementary school, middle school, even sometimes they can go all the way up to high school, and then they're not really performing up to their ability. Like they're not performing as well as you would expect them to, and they end up being labeled as either underachievers or lazy or, not motivated, and they get all these labels, but because there's a disability that has not been picked up earlier. And then there are another category are the ones who are identified as having a learning disability, but the giftedness is unrecognized. So that's kind of the opposite end, where these are students who may have shown some like pretty clear behavioral issues at a younger age, like, really hard time paying attention. They're pretty hyperactive. They're, they maybe have like clear signs of ADHD, but because of this, they're not able to really show what they're actually capable of, right? They're not able to, they're performing sort of average because their disability is masking their giftedness. And then there's the third category, which is the toughest category. So these are the ones whose giftedness and disability mask each other. So these are kids who are just kind of in a general classroom. They appear to have average abilities. They are not really showing any clear disabilities either. And these are the ones who I enjoy working with a lot, but they're the ones who you really need to do a very thorough assessment with. So these are kids where you need to get a ton of information. When I first meet with the parents, really digging very deep into the developmental history, digging deep into where are you seeing some, um, variability or disconnection, things where they're so good at this, but they have such a hard time with this, trying to pick up on patterns, talking about what they're like at school versus at home versus, at, um, the robotics class, for example. And uh, talking to the teachers is really, really important. They can pick up on some of these things as well. Monitoring for any deviations. So they're tougher kids because it's easy to miss them for sure. Um, all right, so now how does the interaction of giftedness and disability show up? So for some of these kids, we might end up seeing greater intensity of the disability. So just as an example, the combination of giftedness and ADHD can lead to intensified curiosity, which can reduce the child's ability for inhibition or to shift their focus. So think of a kid who is incredibly smart and also has really strong ADHD. um, Ask them to write like a short paragraph about, their favorite food or something. And maybe 3 hours later, they're deep down the web looking at like what was, people in the ice age eating. I don't know. Like, they just really like get super intense, super focused, go so deep down, and then they don't end up getting the job done because they get so curious about things, and it might be hard to kind of sustain their attention on what they're supposed to do. The greater knowledge base and fast assimilation of information can increase the difficulty with impulse control. So again, think about a child who's incredibly smart and who knows the answers to probably most of the stuff that the teacher's asking. And so they're blurting out answers and they're having a hard time with turn taking and they're having a hard time not being bored. And so we might see these an intensification, for example, of ADHD, if that's the profile we're talking about. Another thing we might notice is masking the disability. So, the high intellectual ability of 2E learners can lead them to perform at or even above grade level, especially early on, which hides the need for intervention. So, again, demands are low early on, and kids who are 2E are really, really smart. So, you might not notice that there is an issue for a while because they're smart enough to find ways to work around their challenges. They can find a different way of solving a problem that might take so much longer and it might be not maybe the most efficient, but they can get to it. And so because of that, they get by for much longer. And because of that, it delays early intervention. And of course, we all know early intervention is kind of the best intervention. So um, it can get in the way of getting intervention early on, and it can make just things a little more challenging than they need to be. Uh, a child may also be highly verbal and have very complex understanding of material, and so they're not the ones that raise flags. Like at school, like kid seems really smart. They're not the ones where the teacher's like, "Oh yeah, I think this kid probably needs help. I, should recommend that their parents seek an evaluation," for example. So they again fly under the radar much easier. And then there's unfortunately kind of this other issue of emergence of a new challenge. So if there's no early intervention, if they go on for a long time without getting the support they need and not being identified, what happens is that they end up developing poor self-concept because of these differences of like what they believe to do, able they're able to do, and their performance. So things like emotional, behavioral, social difficulties begin to emerge, and we're going to talk much more about that later. But this is something that can become a byproduct of not being able and not identified early on. All right. I'm briefly going to talk about the most common 2E profiles. So one common category are children who are gifted and who also have ADHD. So there are concerns that the characteristics of gifted learners can be confused with ADHD, leading to misidentification by people who are unfamiliar with both. And actually, in this situation, we're not talking about a child who's 2E. We're talking about a child who's actually gifted and who's in the wrong environment. And so they're showing signs that could look like ADHD. So gifted students who are not challenged often become inattentive, they daydream, they get distracted. And so this is again why an evaluation would be helpful to find out does my child have ADHD, or is my child gifted and they're just not being challenged and then they're in the wrong learning environment. So some of these characteristics or symptoms might kind of show up looking the same, but the root of it may be different. The high ability children with ADHD may also show performance that's very similar to that of average ability students. So kind of similar to what I was talking about before with masking. Kids who have ADHD have, sometimes have low frustration tolerance. They get kind of fed up quickly. They have poor attention to details. They have impulsivity. And so they might end up just doing average at school, which is still impressive because they have the ADHD, but because of their cognitive abilities, maybe they're performing average. And so they're not really working up to their potential. We're not getting what we can they're not doing the best they can because of the ADHD. And then there are gifted students with a learning disability, and that's another common category. So whether that be reading, writing, or math, a lot of gifted students with learning disability can perform at grade level if the curriculum is too easy or if they're putting way more effort than they really should. Again, that kind of leading to that later identification for them. Gifted students are at a greater risk of not being identified with a learning disorder because of the perception that they must be failing or performing well below grade level. And that is not true. We're going to talk more about kind of advocacy and support, but they don't need to be failing. They don't need to be bombing for them to receive services and accommodations and support. So important to keep that in mind. There are the gifted students with autism. I think that's probably what most people think of when they think twice exceptional. So, previously it was known as Asperger's. Asperger's is not in the DSM anymore. Now it's just autism spectrum disorder. But these are what you imagine the kids who are on the spectrum and are incredibly intelligent and have incredible talents, like really, really high Q or super impressive memory, or an amazing ability of, for example, looking at a map and telling you the capital of every city everywhere. And so some of these impressive abilities, and also being on the spectrum. Kids who are on this, who are 2E and have autism tend to have really impressive verbal skills, really impressive reading skills, and that can lead to them masking the signs of autism for a long time. So these kids can learn how to do so. Like these things may not be supernatural for them, but they're smart enough to look around and to learn how do people act in certain situations. What do people say? Oh, people are laughing. This is probably funny. I should be laughing. So some of the kind of learning this of what they're supposed to do, and so they kind of mask some of the autism symptoms, and they end up getting diagnosed much later. All right, now social, emotional, and behavioral needs. So 2E children have difficulty with social skills and with fitting in, or at least some of them have difficulty with social skills. You can imagine, especially if they're in the wrong learning environment, fitting in might be really tough because they don't really fall in either category, and they might find it hard to find their tribe, right? Um, Some develop low self-esteem after starting school specifically. There are a lot of studies that have found that children with high IQ and ADHD are actually moodier and they have a higher rate of anxiety, disruptive behavior compared to children with just ADHD. So the addition of being gifted actually makes them more anxious, more disruptive. So it's a problem. Frustration leads to disruptive behavior, aggression, low frustration tolerance. There's another study that found that learning disabled students with superior abilities show show significantly lower academic self-efficacy, feelings of failure, and are the most destructive compared to students with average or even students with high intelligence. So superior, high, average, and the kids who are superior are actually showing or experiencing more feelings of failure and lower academic self-efficacy. These kids are just getting a lot of mixed messages, both internally and externally. So they're getting these messages that they're super smart, and yet they're failing or not doing well enough. These kids assume that things will come easy to them because early on, when their demands are not that high, things come so easy to them. And so when they eventually end up hitting a point where the disability is really getting in the way, it's a kind of a shock to the system. They tend to report feeling confused, bored. So it becomes really difficult to kind of make sense of themselves really. And they're also the piece of the expectations, like the expectations of parents, of teachers, of people who can see their impressive abilities, and so they expect them to perform just as well in every area, not recognizing that the child may actually have a disability in one area that makes it difficult to have these kind of expectations. And so there needs to be some shift to what are realistic expectations. All right, we talked a lot about the challenges. Now let's talk about how to support the kids. So I'm going to start with parent advocacy because that's kind of the most important thing. And this is an excerpt from a study that was done in 2015 that focused on the experience of parents with 2E children. I'm going to read this little part for you. It was by a parent of a child who's 2E. So she says, "Whoa, slow down. Why can't we have an IEP? The school basically said he's not failing, he's in advanced classes, he's gifted, he doesn't need anything. Sorry, we know what you're asking for, but no dice around here." And I said, "Fine, he's in advanced classes. Take him out of advanced classes because he's making C's in those. So take him out of advanced math so he can be making A's, which he deserves to be making." They all looked at me and said, "Oh, he'll be so bored." And I said, "Yes, I know. And his behavior will be even worse than it is now." Super frustrating. Super, super frustrating. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so parent advocacy. Again, a child's most important advocate is their parent. There are several studies that have shown that parent recognition is one of the first and kind of most essential steps. So you know your child best. Even educators who know what twice exceptional is and have training on it, they're not always the ones to pick it up first. Parents have this sense of kind of recognizing that my child is unique. Like I am noticing that some things are so easy, some things are so hard. There's more to this. And so parents tend to pick up on this really early on. And again, a lot of studies have actually shown that knowledge and knowing about your rights and knowing about policies can be really important in advocating for your child. If you're in doubt, get the child evaluated. If you're feeling like there's some sort of mismatch or there's something missing or there is this, you know, there's more to dig into, get them evaluated. That's probably the best way to find out more about their strengths and their challenges. Collaboration is, of course, really important in these situations. I mean, in all situations, but it's important to work with the student, the parent, the teacher, the school administration, therapist, everybody working together to to come up with a plan that works for this child because of their unique profile and because of the way that like just a typical support may need to look different for them. They can't just have like kind of a template of how to support this kid. And then I'm going to say this probably a million times, but be informed about school policies and rights. It's really important to know your rights. So, kind of speaking to that excerpt, the one I just read about the parent, section 1412 from the IDEA says that the law states that students do not have to be failing or achieving below grade level to qualify for special education. So according to the individuals, according to the IDEA, it states that states must make a free, appropriate public education available to any individual child with a disability who needs special education and related services, even if the child has not failed or been retained in a course or grade and is advancing from grade to grade. They don't need to be bombing, they don't need to be failing to get the services they need. So that is a lot. How to support to each children. All right, so first, strength, talent-based programs. That's it. We can't for these kids, we can't only focus on the disability, right? So we really need to make sure that they're in a program that creates a talent-focused environment, uses inquiry-based learning, allows them extra time for exploration. Therapy is, of course, really important. We talked about the social and emotional challenges. And so teaching social skills, developing a deeper awareness of their strengths and weaknesses is so important. Building a cohesive sense of self, trying to help them understand that you don't have to be one or the other. You can kind of be one person who has all of these characteristics, and reducing family pressure on kids. Technology can be super helpful for these kids. So giving modification accommodations when they're necessary and allowing exploration in the area of interest, assistive technology. So if you think about, a kid who has to write a short essay and they're putting so much in writing is maybe one of their disability, and they're just putting so much effort into the actual process of writing that they're used up all their cognitive kind of resources with the writing, and they're so exhausted after, and it impacts what they're able to produce. So if we can give them technology that can help with that, relieve some of that cognitive demand or task on them, and have it allocated to something like organizing their thoughts and writing their ideas down, even if it's on a tablet or a computer, it's worth it. Or a kid with dyslexia, for example, being able to, especially later on when they're not learning to read, but reading to learn, right? So they're, now in later middle school and they're in high school, and they can listen to an audiobook if the idea is that I just need to learn what I'm reading. They don't need to be reading the book physically. Art, so emphasizing multi-sensory approaches, sharpening their creativity, increasing their self-efficacy, improving their organizational skills, which sometimes tend to be a real issue. Okay. And now educational programming, there's a lot to be said about that. So programs, there are programs designed and designated for gifted children with the use of methods for working with the kids' learning difficulties. There is well-documented academic benefits of peer ability grouping for gifted children. So here, it's really, really important to be in an environment with kids with a similar kind of learning profile, similar cognitive profile. You want them to be in a place where they're also being challenged by their classmates, they're not feeling bored, they're stimulated, and they're also seeing that there are other people who have their own challenges and things that are difficult for them. And so being in that kind of environment has, obviously it's kind of the best environment to be in if it's possible. In one meta-analysis, which just means basically like a summary of a bunch of other studies. So in meta-analysis suggested that for 2E children to make appropriate progress, the primary focus should be on developing their skills and using their strengths. Again, you don't want to just focus on the disability. We want to support it and make sure we're remediating it, but really focus on their strengths. Some also actually support the idea of acceleration or advanced courses. So taking a course, when appropriate, taking an advanced course might be a good idea. So they're not so bored in their first grade class, for example, first grade reading when they're reading at a third grade level, for example. And then again, collaboration, especially for these two E kids. So working with their gifted education teacher, their parents, their um, therapists. I'm going to talk more about schools because I think this is probably something a lot of you are interested in. So, I'll start first with the two E schools. So, like I said, there are schools that are designed specifically to develop the strengths and interest and superior intellect, as well as remediate their deficits. There are two E schools. There are several of them in the city, and they have teachers who have been trained and who are not just trained, like teachers who are very familiar with what a twice exceptional student looks like. They have supportive counseling. They have the kind of a nurturing environment that really focuses on the talents and the exceptionality and the giftedness, um, and knows how to support the challenges. For example, so like, yeah, ideally that's where you would want to be if possible. It's not possible for everyone, of course, but ideally that's where you would want to be. Some examples is the ideal school. The ideal school is one really like a school for twice exceptional kids. There's also the flex school. There's also quad prep, the length school. Um, so these are the ones I'm familiar with, but there are probably a few others. Um, when a 2E school or a specialized school is not an option, there's also public school. And of course, it's not, you know, just know that if we're going the public school route, you're going to be doing a lot of advocating for your child. And so it's just going to require a little bit more work on your end because they're not as familiar and you're having to play a little bit of for the accommodations and kind of proving the need. So it just takes a little bit more work on your part. But like I read to you that the law states that they don't need to be completely failing to get services or to qualify for an EP. There are also, I was looking up there are the gifted DOE programs, and gifted DOE, being in a gifted and talented program through the DOE does not disqualify you from getting an IEP. So you can be in a gifted program and also qualify for an IEP. And so you're hopefully being surrounded by also other children who are gifted and have, similar cognitive profile in some ways. But then you'll have your kind of tailored IEP to work on the area that is more of a challenge for you. So these are some options. Know your rights, know your rights, know your rights. That's super important. And I don't want to get into the law of it too much, but when a public school, and some of you might know this already, but when you've tried the public school route and you're really not seeing that it's a good fit for your child and they're not making the progress that they need to be making and they're still really struggling, working with an educational lawyer might not be a bad idea to try to find a better fit for your child. And there are different laws like the Carter funding law or the Connor funding law. These are laws that basically say that when when the DOE can't provide your child with the services that they need, or with an environment that's the least restrictive environment that's working for them, they can actually pay for your child to be in a specialized program that is paid for by the DOE. And there are layers to this, but just for the sake of time, I won't get too deep into it, but I can answer more questions about it, or I'm also going to provide you with some resources to look into it more. Okay, and then how to support the social and emotional needs. So fostering a clear understanding of their strengths and weaknesses to promote self-understanding and self-acceptance. So We want to encourage them to succeed by setting realistic goals and accepting their limitations and rewarding their accomplishments. Teaching coping strategies to use when they become frustrated. Therapy can be really, really helpful for that. And giving them opportunities to act in leadership roles with peers, especially in areas where they excel. Social skills groups can also be really helpful in developing social awareness and perspective taking, especially for kiddos who might have a hard time, like might be on the spectrum and might have a little bit of a harder time with that perspective taking piece. Encouraging them to utilize therapy again, being aware of their strengths and their weaknesses, and really making sure that they sort of understand have a good understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, and not feel shame behind it. So every evaluation that I do, I start with this little picture book that talks about the brain and kind of explains, why we're doing this evaluation and what your brain does. And part of it talks about how the brain sends messages and how we have highways and how we have construction roads. And for kids who are super gifted, they have a lot of highways, right? They have these things that happen, the messages get sent from one place of the brain to the other really fast. They don't need to think about it. It happens really easily. Construction roads. So these are the kind of neurons that are working a lot slower at sending messages. They're the things that are a lot more challenging and they take a lot more learning. And just for a child early on to be aware that that's normal. It's okay for the brain to have its highways and to have its construction roads, and not feel shame behind that, and to try to support the construction roads so that they can become a little bit faster. And but it's okay for everybody to have their strengths and their challenges. It's natural. Um, all right, resources. So Advocates for Children is a wonderful advocacy uh, program. They're a bunch of educational lawyers. They specifically work with families who are disadvantaged, so families that make earn below a certain amount. But their website is extremely helpful. I go to it all the time. So they have a lot of good resources for parents about what their rights are and what some resources are available for them and guidelines. So I highly recommend checking out their website, Advocates for Children. These are also books that I typically recommend to parents who have 2E children, so Different Minds, Gifted Children with ADHD, Asperger's Syndrome, Other Learning Deficits, and also Smart by Scattered is another good book. Course, if you have any questions or need to learn more about any of this, reach out to us at hello@smallbrooklyn.com. We're always here to support you. And now it's time for questions. So I'm gonna stop my sharing.
Thanks so much, Amira. It's
Yeah.
really awesome to hear about all of your different experiences, and you clearly know a lot about this issue. So thanks for sharing that with all of us. We definitely had a lot of questions in the Q&A. If anyone still has questions, feel free to add them in. I'm going to do my best to get to as many of them as we can. We also had several questions in the registration box, so we'll do our best. If there's anything that we cannot get to today, you had a particular question, feel free to email me or Amira. We'll answer as best we can. Certainly, if you want to have a longer conversation, you're welcome to set up a consultation appointment with us. So let's start and say, some people are definitely asking a lot about how to get educational supports. And I know you covered that, especially in the idea that the law does not say that kids have to be failing in order to get services. And that is a myth that a lot of people, even in the Department of Education and teachers and things, still believe. I'm going to take the charitable route and say that they just don't know, as opposed to the idea that maybe they're trying to gatekeep, expensive services. So they just don't know necessarily that this is not true. And so a lot of the work that we do, a lot of work in that special education attorneys do, special advocates do, um, they have to advocate for these particular services. So one parent specifically asked, despite clearly identified behavioral attention challenges in the classroom, the teachers seem to be indicating that the kiddo won't be eligible for much support because they're meeting grade standards. We know the kiddo is capable of more than they are showing. What can they advocate for, and what are the next steps here? What do you think?
Maybe, I'm sorry, can you ask the question one more time?
Yeah. So basically, if the parent knows that a kid is not performing at their level, the teachers agree that they're having particular problems, but the teachers are giving the advice that because the kiddo isn't meeting grade standards, they're not going to be able to get extra services. What recourse do the parents have? How can they get what they feel the kid needs?
Yeah, so I mean, starting with getting an evaluation to just really look at the child's brain, look at their cognitive abilities, look at what they are, the kind of the discrepancies of what they can do versus what they're actually doing. So kind of that difference between like their IQ, for example, and their reading skills. So once we get that done, I think then you really want to use the advocacy piece. So your neuropsychologist can actually work to advocate with you. And then if advocating through the neuropsychologist and kind of talking about the rights is not enough, sometimes working with an educational lawyer is kind of the way to go eventually. They tend to believe us most of the time. So I think having a really thorough assessment that can detail some of these challenges, they tend to typically go with our recommendation. But in some situations, we do need to work with an educational lawyer to fight a little bit more for them to get the services. Again, the law states they don't need to be failing to get them. So, um,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
it's simply one of the realities, the sad realities of the situation. I think that sometimes, like, you need a doctor to, say on a very lengthy report that a child needs services, even though a parent has been saying it, and even the teachers have been saying it for a
yeah,
long time, but they don't really want to admit that's true until the doctor says that it's true. So, absolutely, the neuropsychologist can open doors that I think parents are not able to otherwise. Um, how about and we'll come back to the idea of evaluations in a minute because another parent asked another question. But how about services or extra knowledge about kids that maybe you don't have to go through a neuropsychological evaluation for? Is there anything out there that parents and teachers can do even without going through a pricey private evaluation?
to receive the services.
Yeah, or even just to like support kids in some ways that maybe
Yeah,
doesn't involve.
yeah.
So
I mean,
I guess there are a couple of different realms here. There's like the private evaluation,
right.
which opens a lot of doors and forces a lot of sort of legal paperwork, like an IEP to provide services. Then there's sort of the middle road, which is the IEP on its own that the school district has agreed that even without a private neuropsych, yes, we agree that these are issues. And the problem
Mhm.
that I have found with those with 2E kids in particular, which is an unfortunate particular disadvantage here, is that but they're not failing problem.
Yeah,
And I feel like a lot of the DOE evaluations are less willing to or able to capture a lot of the nuances that exist
yeah,
in a 2E profile. A lot of times they'll just do a psychoed evaluation and say, well, he's not failing and therefore we don't need services. All right. So there's that DOE route that does not involve the private evaluation. And then I feel like there's more of the informal accommodations route where maybe there's no evaluation at all, but teachers are doing what they can in the classroom. Parents are doing what they can to supplement
right.
support at home or outside school.
Yeah, certainly. I
You've
mean,
seen this work.
yeah, like if we see clearly, for example, reading is a problem, there are reading specialists that you can work with outside of the school. And then you can it's much easier to get a 504 plan through a school. So these don't require services, they're just accommodations. So they're a little bit they're much more willing to kind of go with that. It doesn't cost them much. So that things like getting better, kind of flexible seating or getting extra time on a test or getting kind of prompts, those kind of things. And then you also there are a ton of really great programs for gifted children that I would recommend if you're not getting that through school. There are summer camps, and there are a lot of like the Davidson program. There are a lot of programs that are for gifted children, and so trying to engage your child in these type of activities outside of school, if they're not getting that stimulation at school, is also really helpful. So trying to
Yeah,
find
for
it in
sure.
other places when you can.
Sounds good. So one of the previous questions was about the pros and cons of doing an evaluation. How often do evaluations find nothing? Parents are both possibly 2E, and dad insists that he turned out fine. I'm assuming that means so kid must be fine too.
Yeah.
Child is doing okay in kindergarten, so they're a bit scared of disrupting her life, or if they're wrong and she isn't 2E. And of course, evaluations are expensive. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Evaluations are expensive. And
Because there's a lot of work that goes into them. We'll just
I
say
was going
that.
to say that. So they're
That's always a
expensive.
question I get, right? Why is it so expensive?
Yeah, yeah. You can't even imagine how many hours go into it. But um I can't see a I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I really don't see a disadvantage of getting an evaluation besides the cost, of course. It's a really great way for you to learn about your child's brain and for your child to know about their brain. So whether they end up being 2E or not, whether they have a diagnosis or not, I mean, it's infrequent, I will say, that a child will go through an evaluation and that a parent thinks, I think we need an evaluation, and then they come and there is nothing. It happened, sometimes there is no diagnosis, but typically if you have a concern, there's something behind that. And so a lot of times it's a really good way to learn about their strengths, to learn about their challenges, to know really cool and neat and fun details about their brain and what they're really good at and what is challenging, and giving them support regardless of diagnosis. Really, like we want to know what they're good at so we can use it more, and we want to know what's hard so that we can support it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's really any situation in which, we found out nothing from the neuropsychological evaluation. There's always some interesting piece of information that really resonates with parents to be able to say, oh, I had no idea that his visual spatial skills were so much stronger than his verbal skills. That really explains a lot why he's so into math and maps and drawing and music and all that kind of stuff. And now that I know that, I'm going to make sure that I support that even more. Or, um, oh, it really makes a lot of sense that his processing speed is slower than I realized. I thought he just wasn't paying attention to me, but maybe he just needs extra time to think through what it is that I'm saying and figure out how he's going to respond. There's always something. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even for some kids who maybe don't meet full criteria but are showing some like kind of clear weaknesses early on, it's a great way to find that out early on and get the intervention. And maybe they'll never really meet that criteria eventually if they're
right.
getting that intervention so early. Like, phonological skills, for example, like that sound word, like having some of these issues early on, and maybe they're not impacting their academics yet, but getting that support super early is kind of the best way to go about it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. What you said about maybe not fully meeting criteria for a diagnosis. I think that comes up maybe even more so for our 2E kids, that I think it's important for parents to know. A lot of people, come in thinking that you either have ADHD or you don't have ADHD, or you have autism or you don't have autism. And a lot of, I think, psychologists have to do a little education to help parents understand that, it really, everything kind of exists on a spectrum, and whether they have a diagnosis or not, the line is, it's a little fuzzy. And all of these characteristics exist in the public. It's just deciding at what point are they so pervasive, so intense, and so impairing that they require a diagnosis. But a kid, for example, who's very bright, who's having a lot of executive functioning challenges, who might not fully meet criteria for ADHD, doesn't mean that he couldn't benefit from support for his executive functioning challenges. And I know that's actually a nice segue into one of our other questions, because a parent asked, what happens when, like they were saying that as they were listening to you, they were realizing that maybe their high schooler who's a senior now, that this explains a lot of his more nuanced difficulty earlier on in education. They couldn't
Yeah.
quite figure out what was going on. And so, do you have any tips for support in the college years? What, are there any steps that they should take before he graduates this year?
Yeah, for sure. It's a tough kind of transition from high school to college. I think the kids have a lot more structure, have a lot more support up until high school, and then they're on their own in college. And I mean, it's a transition for everybody, but especially kids who might have executive function issues, and now, their schedule's all over the place. They're keeping track of everything. It can be a tough transition, and so I think it can be really helpful to kind of invest in maybe working. I mean, certainly tools. There are a lot of tools and helping them use the tools that are available, like things as simple as like using, your Google Calendar to put every single final or midterm you have on your calendar so you can plan for it in advance. All of these different, checklists, all of these things that they prepared for before going to college so they can use them. Investing in an executive function coach might be a really good idea, at least in the first semester or so, just until they learn some of these skills and make sure that they're okay. Because the
Mhm.
first
Or
semester is,
now, or now, like even
or
start
no,
having them like build some of those structures now so that they like sort of have some of that foundation in place for the fall. That these coaches really help to teach kids how to set up these sorts of routines for themselves. And I know you did this in your past,
yeah,
Amira.
yeah, absolutely. Like, towards the end of high school and transition into the first first 1 or 2 semesters in college, it's good to have this so that you're not the nagging parent who's annoying them and not giving them their independence. It's nice when it's someone else from the outside, just making sure that they're staying on track.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it frees us up to nag them about other things.
Yeah.
Um, so lots of other questions about education. So for example, one parent says, it seems like there's no good public school options for 2E kids. Her son is in Nest right now. They said that they really need to choose about whether they want him to really excel academically or leave the program, or whether we want him to develop his social skills and stay. It seems like defeat no matter which we do. What do you do or say in these situations? I mean, have you run across any like potential options? I gotta say I don't have good answers in Brooklyn. Across the board, I feel like gifted and talented classes are at least differentiating the work for kids, and I think that they have some extra knowledge and how to help kids with executive functioning, but doesn't always come out. A lot of those classes are very full, and the teachers don't always have the resources to help individualize supports for individual kids. Um, the gifted schools are supposed to offer ICT classes. That is, if you have a kid who needs an ICT class and it's on your IEP, you're supposed to be able to get that at whatever school you are at. Even the specialized schools, even the accelerated schools and the gifted and talented elementary schools. The reality is it can be very, very difficult to get schools to agree to do that or to say that they have the funding for that. But have you run across any options for yourself, Mia?
I don't have good options either, unfortunately, but exactly what you're saying, like on the NYC, EDU, like on straight on their website, they say our gifted programs, it does not disqualify you from getting an IEP or getting an ICT class. So they say that they acknowledge that you can get all of these services through a DOE gifted and talented program and qualify for the IEP, but I honestly don't know specific programs that do it really well or it, yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah. And it's I think one of the ways that the 2E special needs schools do flourish. It's not everybody's cup of tea, and you don't necessarily want to go down this road, but for anyone who chooses to go through an impartial hearing process to get private school tuition paid for at the 2E schools, you have a very clear argument to say the DOE cannot provide a free and appropriate public education for my child who needs special education services and gifted accelerated services. That is one of the reasons why a lot of these suits are successful. Um, it's always worth talking to a special education attorney about.
For sure.
All right, we are a couple of minutes over, but I'm going to answer a few more of these questions. I don't think we're going to get to everything, and I'm very sorry. One of the questions was, what's the name of the book that you use with children? The highways and construction zones. I think it's
The Liz Angoff one.
yeah, it's written for practitioners to use with kids in neuropsych evaluations, but the author is Liz Angoff, Angoff. She actually has quite a few great resources for parents on her site as well as practitioners. I think that the book is called the Brain Building Book, if I'm not
I
mistaken.
think so
But I
too. But
highly
yeah,
recommend it.
yeah, yeah. It's more made so that the neuropsychologist can kind of start the evaluation talking about why we're doing it and kind of explaining the brain a bit. But she has other great resources for sure.
Yeah, so Google for Liz Angoff, Angoff. How do you talk to kids about the disability and the giftedness without making them feel boxed into either? We have talked to our child about his ADHD, and now we hear him talk about how he can't do some things because of his ADHD. That's actually why I really love this book, because it talks about it as construction zones. It is not a barrier, it is an area under development, and it can always be developed. But I keep talking over you, Amira. I'm sorry.
No, no, that's yeah. I mean, it's we don't use it. It's a way to help us understand why some things are harder. It's not something that we cannot do. It's not like an excuse to stop doing things. It's just an understanding of why it might be more challenging and what kind of things can we use to make it less challenging. It's not an excuse to stop doing things altogether. But we again talked so much about the social emotional needs and the unique needs of the for these kids. So kind of trying to work through that and really understand themselves better in therapy can be really helpful because it's to be so good at something and then have such a hard time with something else. It's a confusing place to be. And just talking about
Mhm.
it in therapy can be helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, my middle school child has a 504, but it doesn't help him with note taking and in-class work, which is what he really struggles with the most. He's managed to do okay in elementary school, but it's now becoming apparent that he needs help. Would an IEP help? What would an IEP provide?
I probably want to know more about a lot more about like kind of their specific needs to answer that, but
Yeah,
you should be able, I mean, note taking should be something that can go on a 504. You don't need an IEP for a note taker or for some of the technology stuff. So I would
it's true.
talk to the school about adding that, or whoever initially, kind of created the 504 about adding that. That if that's the only issue, you don't need an IEP for that for sure. But I imagine there are other things that are getting in the way, but I'd have to know more details.
Feel free to reach out. Our son was found to have a 125 IQ and is neuropsych, not autistic. Neuropsych points to possible ADHD to be monitored going forward. Mood disorder unspecified. The evaluator recommended that we look into 2E programs. Is that 130 IQ a hard line for this diagnosis? We're unclear about whether the diagnosis of 2E would be accepted by schools or a judge, et cetera.
Yeah, so again, just to be really clear, 2E is not a diagnosis, it's more of a cognitive profile. So it's a way, again, of understanding that they have strengths, they have challenges. There is no cutoff, there is no specific, like hard line to get a diagnosis. It's not a diagnosis. And kids can have talents that are not even kind of necessarily IQ related. Like they might be, geniuses at specific art or, different things. A 2E school sounds like a good idea. I think I actually would want to know how old the kid is because if they're showing hints of things and they have not met them yet, I wonder if the demands have just not been um challenging enough and that they eventually would be meeting criteria for some of these things. But I mean, um I think I forgot the end of the question, but was the end of the question, is a 2E program appropriate?
But also, is that label, I guess, going to be
Oh yeah.
accepted by schools or a judge, et cetera?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, yeah, it's just kind of it require a lot of advocating to try to get some of the services if they're not meeting the criteria. So it would just require a lot more back and forth fighting to get them what they need, especially if they're in a DOE
Yeah, I
program.
think that's true. Unfortunately, I think that the possible ADHD and the mood disorder unspecified is a little weak sauce. Um, and it will just require more documentation of his specific problems and evidence from teachers and all of that to be able to say, despite these sort of vague diagnoses, these are the clear, concrete problems that he's having, and his teachers agree and that sort of thing. So again, always worth talking to a special education attorney. A lot of them, they are super direct about whether they think that you have a case. They do not want to take on a a case that they don't think that you're going to win or that they're going to win. So they're gonna give you their adequate or their expert opinion on that. Here's a good one that we encounter all the time, Amira. Our kiddo had a hard time in his CPSE eval. He was clearly doing his own thing instead of following directions, even for things that we know he can do. Super distractible, not super motivated by the approval of others. How to find evaluators that can work with him to make sure that testing is accurate. We never see
Oh,
that, right?
never. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge there, and I think just having the right environment, having the right evaluator who's kind of familiar with this kind of uh challenge, and taking it at the child's pace, because I think what we want to do is get the best, right? And like get them at their best and be able to give them as many breaks as necessary. Like the Department of Education might not have the time and the resources to do that. They just need to get what they can get in a certain amount of time.
Yeah,
But just being patient with them and trying to really get them at their best, going at their own pace, taking breaks, giving them rewards, having reward charts, like having all of these different motivators, internal, external, whatever works for the kid. It's every kid is unique, every kid is motivated by different things. And so trying to get that understanding from the parents when we initially meet with them is important. And then when we meet with the kid, it's um we almost always get what we need by the end. It can be challenging and some days are harder than others, but I think it's all also good clinical information that we can work through. You just
that's
need the
absolutely
time
true.
and patience for it.
Yeah. Um, if you are interviewing potential private neuropsychs, ask that question specifically. What do you do when a kid is not following your instructions or isn't answering the questions and you can tell that, they can do more than they are showing? What are your specific, look for specific and concrete steps that the evaluator will take. Obviously, you always want somebody who's going to be taking the time to build rapport with the child, but also looking for somebody who's going to be very flexible. Hey, it looks like you're not having a great day today. Let's end early and reschedule for another day. Just like Amira was saying with the DOE evaluator, sometimes they don't have the ability to be able to do that. They just need to just get through these things. But a private neuropsych really should be able to be flexible in that way, able and willing to be flexible in that way. And so you want to see, that kind of ability to work with a specific child. In the end, even the most attentive and flexible and creative neuropsych sometimes has a really hard time getting or cannot get a child to show what he really knows. And that's super frustrating. But that neuropsychologist also should be being creative on the other pieces of the neuropsych as well. So in that situation, I talk more explicitly to the teachers, to the therapists. I want to go and see them in the classroom sometimes. I really want more information from parents to really understand what they are seeing at home and what the child is able to do. All of those things become much more important when I'm not able to see it with my own eyes. But it doesn't mean that I won't believe you that this, this child can write beautifully when he is not rolling around in my office. And I will say, all of that in my report that the testing that I have collected does not seem to reflect his real ability. And I estimate that it is, at this level rather than this level based on his performance in school, that kind of thing. And then just one last question, who asking kind of a similar question about how her daughter, who was 3.5, went through a CPSC evaluation. It was pretty inconclusive because she didn't want to engage with the diagnostic activities. And so she's asking a little bit more about when does it make sense to pursue a nurse? Like, was she just too young? Is it better to wait and give her more time to develop? What do you think?
Well, I don't know I don't know how old the child is now. It seems like they got evaluated when they're about 3.5.
Right.
It
That's true.
yeah.
And
There's
what
a
the reason is. I think that that makes a big difference
yeah,
too. Like, what's the reason
yeah,
for the evaluation?
right.
Um, I think that there's a lot that you can get at 3.5, honestly. And then I think that there's more rich information that you can get, especially about academic abilities as kids get older. But there are certainly plenty, even at 3.5, that you can understand about early skills that lead to or may prevent effortless, like reading, for example.
Hmm.
Even at 3.5, there's stuff that we can know. So there's really no hard and fast line. But pre-K, Amira, is kind of a rule of thumb sometimes for,
Yeah,
learning disabilities and things like that.
yeah. Um, I yeah, I tend yeah, I mean pre-K sounds good. I usually see kids like 6 and up, but there's a lot of benefits to kids who are under, especially again, depending on what the question is. Like if we're talking autism, I'd probably say the earlier the better for sure.
Yeah,
Reading, maybe you could hold off a little bit, but
right.
there are the indications even for the younger ones for sure.
Yeah. At 3.5, like in the toddler age, a lot of the questions are pertaining more to autism. And
Right.
I think that you can absolutely get a good evaluation at that stage, as well as understanding about the early academic skills. ADHD, I would say more like 4 or 5. When they're 3, it's really hard to tell the difference between a normal, 3 and an ADHD 3. So I would feel more comfortable with 4 or 5 in that context, and then the academic stuff. Um, yeah, like Amira was saying, you can wait a little bit more on the reading, but again, the sooner that you intervene, the better the outcomes are. So even in reading, if you have a 3-year-old, 4-year-old who you're in their class and you see that everybody else can name letters, for example, and he just has like not only no interest, but also like resistance to it, that might be something that's worth looking into further. Or, even at 3, if they are not joining in with group activities, they are bouncing all around the classroom. They really can't sit and look at letters for very long. Um, there's good information that you can get out of that. Okay. Well, we are very over time at this point, so I think we need to go ahead and end, even though we have a couple of other questions. So please do reach out to me if and Amira. She is Amira at smallbrooklyn.com. I am Mandi with an I at smallbrooklyn.com. You can also reach our general email account, hello at smallbrooklyn.com. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. Thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks as always to Park Slope Parents for helping us to share information and support parents everywhere. So have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.